The biker was dying. Everyone expected him to ask for beer, money, or one last ride. But instead, his final wish was whispered to a kind old lady. She granted it without hesitation, and the next morning, the roar of 100 bikes shook her front yard. What happened next left the entire town in tears. Stay with me until the end, because this story will move you in ways you never imagined. Before we start, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Margaret Thompson had lived in the same small house on Maple Street for 47 years. At 73, she had silver hair that she kept in a neat bun, gentle blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that were always busy with knitting, gardening, or baking for her neighbors. Everyone in Millfield knew Mrs. Thompson as the woman who never said no to someone in need. Her little yellow house sat at the corner of Maple and 3rd, with a garden that burst with roses in summer, and a front porch where she would sit every evening, waving to people as they passed by. The neighborhood children called her Grandma Maggie, even though she had no grandchildren of her own. Her husband Robert had passed away 15 years earlier, and they had never been blessed with children. But Margaret had never let loneliness define her. Instead, she filled her days with acts of kindness that seemed small to her, but meant the world to others. She volunteered at the hospital, delivered meals to shut-ins, and her kitchen always smelled of fresh cookies that somehow found their way to anyone having a difficult day. The town of Millfield was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the hardware store owner would ask about your sick mother, and where the annual county fair was the biggest event of the year. It was peaceful, predictable, and exactly the kind of place where something extraordinary could happen without anyone seeing it coming. That extraordinary something began on a Tuesday morning in late September, when Margaret was tending to her rose bushes. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hint of autumn, and she was carefully pruning the last blooms of the season when she heard the rumble of a motorcycle approaching. The sound grew louder until a massive black Harley-Davidson pulled into her driveway. Margaret had never seen a motorcycle up close before, and this one looked like something from a movie. Chrome gleamed in the morning sunlight, and the engine's deep rumble seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath her feet. The man who climbed off the bike was not what Margaret had expected. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black leather jacket covered with patches and pins. His graying beard was long and braided, and his arms were covered with tattoos that told stories Margaret couldn't read. But when he removed his helmet and looked at her, she saw something in his eyes that she recognized immediately: pain. "Sha, ma'am," he said, his voice rough from years of wind and weather. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Jake Morrison. I was wondering if you might have a glass of water. I've been riding for hours, and I'm not feeling too well." Margaret noticed immediately that something was wrong. Jake's face was pale despite his weathered complexion, and his hands trembled slightly as he set his helmet on the bike's seat. Sweat beaded on his forehead even though the morning was cool. "Of course, dear," Margaret said, setting down her pruning shears and wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "Come up on the porch and sit down. You look like you need more than just water." Jake hesitated for a moment, glancing at his reflection in the chrome of his bike. He knew what he looked like, knew that most people crossed the street when they saw someone like him coming. But there was something in the old lady's voice, a warmth that reminded him of his grandmother from years ago. "I don't want to impose," he said, but Margaret was already heading toward her front door. "Nonsense. Anyone can see you're not well. Come inside where it's comfortable." Margaret's living room was exactly what Jake had expected from the outside of the house. Floral wallpaper, family photographs on every surface, and furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than style. But what surprised him was how peaceful it felt, how the afternoon sunlight streaming through lace curtains seemed to wash away some of the heaviness he'd been carrying for months. "Sit right there," Margaret instructed, pointing to a soft armchair that had clearly been Robert's favorite spot. "I'll get you some water and make us some tea." As Margaret bustled around in the kitchen, Jake found himself looking at the photographs scattered throughout the room. Pictures of Margaret and a man he assumed was her husband, taken over the decades. Wedding photos, vacation pictures, images of a couple who had clearly loved each other deeply. But no children, no grandchildren, just the two of them, growing older together until there was only one. "Here we are," Margaret said, returning with a tray that held not just water and tea, but also a plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies that were still warm from the oven. Jake accepted the water gratefully, drinking it down in long gulps. The tea was hot and sweet, exactly the way his grandmother used to make it. But it was the kindness in Margaret's eyes that made his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do this." "Of course I did," Margaret replied, settling into her own chair across from him. "You needed help, and I was here to give it. That's how these things work." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, Jake sipping his tea, while Margaret studied his face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades caring for others. She could see the exhaustion in his posture, the way he held himself as if he was carrying a weight too heavy for his shoulders. "You're not from around here," she observed gently. Jake shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm from Colorado originally. Been riding for the past 6 months, seeing the country. Always wanted to do that, and I figured now was the time." "That sounds wonderful. Are you traveling alone?" "Yeah. It's just me and the bike." Jake's voice carried a note of sadness that Margaret didn't miss. "My riding buddies, they wanted to come with me, but I needed to do this trip by myself. Had some thinking to do, some things to figure out." Margaret nodded knowingly. "Sometimes we need solitude to hear what our hearts are trying to tell us. Robert used to say that the best conversations are the ones we have with ourselves." Jake looked up at her, surprised by her understanding. Most people saw his leather jacket and his tattoos and made assumptions about who he was, what kind of life he lived. But this gentle old lady was looking past all of that, seeing something deeper. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, then stopped, not sure how to continue. "Call me Margaret, dear, or Maggie if you prefer. Everyone does. Margaret, I need to tell you something. The reason I stopped here, it wasn't just because I needed water." Jake set down his teacup with hands that were shaking more noticeably now. "I'm sick, really sick. The doctors, they gave me maybe 2 weeks, 3 at the outside." Margaret's face didn't change, but Jake saw her hands tighten slightly in her lap. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry." Jake had expected pity, maybe fear, certainly discomfort. Instead, he found compassion so pure it nearly broke him. "The cancer spread faster than they thought it would. Started in my lungs, moved to my liver. I've been riding because I wanted to see things one more time, you know. Feel the wind, watch the sunrise from different places." "That sounds like exactly what you should be doing," Margaret said softly. "Are you in pain? Some days are worse than others." "Today's been rough." Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by the tears he couldn't control. "I'm sorry. I don't usually break down like this in front of strangers." "We're not strangers anymore," Margaret said firmly. "And there's nothing wrong with crying. It means you're human, that you care about the life you're living." Jake looked around the peaceful living room, at the photographs of a long marriage, at the handmade quilts draped over the furniture, at the evidence of a life well lived. "You have a beautiful home, a beautiful life." "I've been blessed," Margaret agreed, "but I can see you have too in your own way. Those patches on your jacket, they tell stories, don't they?" Jake glanced down at his leather vest, covered with pins and patches from motorcycle rallies, charity rides, and clubs he'd belonged to over the years. "Yeah, they do. Each one represents something. A ride, a cause, people I've met along the way. Tell me about them." For the next hour, Jake found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in months. He talked about the charity rides he'd organized for children's hospitals, the veterans groups he'd supported, the brotherhood he'd found among other bikers who understood that beneath the leather and chrome was a family unlike any other. He told her about his late wife, Sarah, who had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, how he'd almost given up then, how his riding buddies had literally dragged him out of his apartment and back onto his bike because they knew it was the only thing that would save him. "Sarah always said I had 2 families," Jake explained, his voice growing stronger as he talked. "The one I was born into, and the one I chose. The riding community, they're not what people think. We look out for each other. When someone falls, we all fall. When someone needs help, we all help." Margaret listened intently, asking questions that showed she truly cared about his answers. As the afternoon wore on, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. "Margaret," he said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I'll understand if you say no." "What is it, dear?" Jake took a deep breath, gathering courage for what he was about to request. "I've been thinking about my funeral. I don't have any family left, and most of my riding buddies are scattered across the country. I was wondering, when the time comes, would you be willing to attend? I know it sounds strange, asking someone I just met, but you've shown me more kindness in one afternoon than I've received in months. I don't want to be buried with no one there who actually cared." Margaret reached across and took his weathered hand in her soft ones. "Oh, Jake, of course I'll be there. But I think you're underestimating how much people care about you." "What do you mean?" "You've spent the afternoon telling me about all the people you've helped, all the causes you've supported, all the lives you've touched. Do you really think those people have forgotten about you?" Jake shrugged. "I've been out of touch for months. When you're dying, you tend to pull away from people. Don't want them to see you weak. That's exactly when people want to be there for you most," Margaret said gently. "Have you told your riding friends about your diagnosis?" "No, I couldn't handle their pity." Margaret stood up and walked to her kitchen, returning with a notepad and pen. "I want you to give me their names and phone numbers." "Margaret, I don't think that's a good idea. Trust me, dear. Sometimes the hardest thing about accepting help is asking for it. But sometimes people need to be given the chance to show their love." Jake hesitated, then slowly began writing down names and numbers. His best friend Tommy in Denver, Big Mike from Phoenix, the Rodriguez brothers from California. By the time he finished, he had filled 3 pages with contacts from across the country. "These are good people," he said, handing her the list. "But they have their own lives, their own problems. And they have you," Margaret replied, "someone they clearly care about, whether you realize it or not." As the sun began to set, Jake knew he needed to continue his journey. He had reservations at a motel 20 miles down the road, and riding in the dark was getting harder for him as his condition worsened. "I should go," he said reluctantly, standing up slowly. "Thank you for everything, Margaret. This afternoon, it means more than you know." Margaret walked him to the door, but stopped him before he could put on his helmet. "Jake, I want to make you a promise. When your time comes, you won't be alone. I'll make sure of that. You don't have to do anything special. Just being there would be enough." "Let me worry about what's enough," Margaret said with a smile that reminded Jake so much of his grandmother that his eyes filled with tears again. Jake hugged her then, this small woman who had given him the gift of human connection when he needed it most. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," she whispered back. As Jake rode away into the twilight, Margaret stood on her porch, watching until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Then she went inside, picked up her phone, and began making calls. The first number she dialed was Tommy in Denver. "Hello? Is this Tommy?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation she was about to have. "Yeah, this is Tommy. Who's this?" The voice on the other end was gruff, cautious. "My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm calling about Jake Morrison. I believe you two are friends." There was a long pause. "Jake? Is he okay? I haven't heard from him in months. We've all been worried sick." Margaret took a deep breath. "Tommy, Jake is very sick. He has cancer, and he doesn't have much time left. He's been traveling alone, and I think he's been trying to protect all of you from the pain of watching him suffer." "Oh, God." Tommy's voice cracked. "We knew something was wrong. He just disappeared after Sarah's anniversary. We kept calling, but he wouldn't answer. Where is he now?" "He's continuing his journey, but Tommy, he needs his family. He needs all of you. He gave me a list of names and numbers because I promised him he wouldn't face this alone." "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but thank you for calling. Give me everyone's numbers. We'll handle this from here." For the next 2 hours, Margaret's phone rang constantly as word spread through the motorcycle community. Each call was the same pattern of shock, grief, and immediate determination to help their brother in his final days. Big Mike from Phoenix was already planning to close his shop and head east. The Rodriguez brothers were mapping out the fastest route from California. Within hours, a network of bikers across the country was mobilizing, united by love for a man who thought he'd been forgotten. Margaret made 17 calls that night, each one easier than the last, as Jake's friends began calling each other, spreading the word through their tight-knit community. By midnight, her kitchen table was covered with notes, phone numbers, and the beginnings of a plan that would honor Jake in ways he never could have imagined. 3 days later, Margaret's phone rang at 6 in the morning. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Dr. Patricia Williams from Mercy General Hospital. We have a patient here, Jake Morris, in town. He's stable now, but his sank. Is he okay? He collapsed at a diner about 30 miles from your. He listed you as his emergency contact. Margaret's heart condition has deteriorated significantly. He keeps asking for you. I'll be right there." Margaret had never driven so fast in her life. When she arrived at the hospital, she found Jake in a private room, looking smaller somehow in the hospital bed. His leather jacket hung on a chair in the corner, and without it, he seemed vulnerable in a way that broke her heart. "Yeah, Margaret," he said when he saw her, his voice weak but filled with relief. "You came." "Of course I came, dear. How are you feeling?" "Like I'm running out of road." Jake tried to smile, but the effort was clearly exhausting. "The doctors say maybe a week if I'm lucky." Margaret pulled a chair close to his bed and took his hand. "Jake, I need to tell you something. I made those phone calls." His eyes widened. "You what?" "I called Tommy and Mike and all the others on your list. They're coming, Jake. They're all coming." To Margaret, number. "I didn't want them to see me like this. I wanted them to remember me strong, healthy, on my bike." "That's not how love works, sweetheart. They don't want to remember you strong. They want to be with you now, when you need them most." Before Jake could respond, there was a knock on the door. Tommy walked in, still wearing his road leathers, his helmet under his arm. Behind him came Big Mike, then the Rodriguez brothers, then more faces than Jake had seen in months. "Hey, brother," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "Heard you were trying to take this ride alone." Jake's eyes filled with tears as his friends surrounded his bed. These tough men, covered in tattoos and leather, were crying openly as they took turns hugging the man they'd thought they might never see again. "How did you all get here so fast?" Jake whispered. "We rode all night," Big Mike said. "Stopped for nothing but gas. When family calls, you answer." Over the next few days, Jake's hospital room became the headquarters for the most unusual family reunion anyone had ever seen. Bikers from across the country arrived in groups, parking their motorcycles in the hospital lot until it looked like a rally was happening outside. The nursing staff had never seen anything like it. These intimidating-looking men and women were the gentlest visitors they'd ever encountered. They brought flowers, homemade food, and stories that made Jake laugh until his sides hurt. Margaret visited every day, bringing fresh cookies and sitting quietly, while Jake's friends shared memories of rides they'd taken together, causes they'd supported, lives they'd touched along the way. She began to understand the depth of the brotherhood Jake had described, watching how they cared for each other with a devotion that put many families to shame. "Margaret," Jake said on his 6th day in the hospital, "I want to ask you something else." "Anything, dear. I've been thinking about what I want for my service. I don't want some stuffy funeral home with people whispering and wearing black. I want a celebration, a ride, something that honors the life I actually lived. Tell me what you're thinking. I want them to ride. All of them. I want them to fire up their bikes and ride through town, letting everyone hear the sound I've loved my whole life. But I want it to end at your house, Margaret. I want the service to be in your backyard, under those trees where we can see the sky. Margaret squeezed his hand. That sounds perfect. There's one more thing. I want you to speak at the service. You're the only person who saw me clearly in these final weeks, who looked past everything else and just saw a man who needed kindness. I would be honored. Jake passed away peacefully 2 days later, surrounded by friends who held his hands and told him stories about the road that waited ahead. Margaret was there too, sitting quietly in the corner, providing the calm presence that had comforted him from their very first meeting. The planning began immediately. Jake's biker family took over the arrangements with military precision, but everything was centered around his final wishes. Margaret opened her home to them, watching in amazement as they transformed her backyard into a celebration space that somehow managed to be both reverent and joyful. Word of Jake's story spread through the motorcycle community faster than anyone had anticipated. Social media posts shared his journey, his kindness, and Margaret's role in ensuring he didn't die alone. Riding groups from states they hadn't even contacted began calling, asking if they could participate in the memorial ride. Mrs. Thompson, Tommy said the night before the service, we've got a situation. We were expecting maybe 50 bikes tomorrow. We've got confirmations for over 200, and more are still calling. Margaret smiled. Jake would love that. But ma'am, that's a lot of motorcycles. The neighbors, the noise, the disruption to your street. Tommy, Jake asked for a ride that would let everyone hear the sound he loved. I think 200 bikes will accomplish that quite nicely. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out at her quiet street, knowing that tomorrow would change everything. She thought about Jake, about the afternoon he'd stumbled into her life asking for water and ended up giving her something she hadn't expected: purpose. For years since Robert's death, Margaret had filled her days with small acts of kindness, but they had felt routine, predictable. Jake had reminded her what it meant to truly connect with another human being, to offer comfort in someone's darkest moment. As dawn broke on the day of Jake's memorial service, Margaret heard the first rumble in the distance. The sound grew steadily louder as more motorcycles joined the procession. Margaret stepped onto her front porch just as the first bike turned onto Maple Street. What she saw took her breath away. The procession stretched as far as she could see, hundreds of motorcycles moving slowly down her quiet residential street. The riders wore their best leather, their bikes polished to perfection, American flags and memorial ribbons fluttering in the morning breeze. But it wasn't just bikers. Mixed in with the Harleys and choppers were families in cars, local business owners who had closed their shops for the morning, neighbors who had never met Jake but had heard his story. The entire town had turned out to honor a man most of them had never known. The lead bike pulled into Margaret's driveway, and Tommy climbed off, removing his helmet with hands that shook with emotion. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely audible over the rumble of engines. Jake would have loved this. One by one, the motorcycles filled her street, her driveway, her yard, and the empty lot next door. Riders dismounted and gathered in her backyard, creating a sea of leather and chrome that somehow felt sacred rather than intimidating. Margaret had prepared remarks, but standing before this crowd of people who had loved Jake in ways she was only beginning to understand, she found herself speaking from her heart instead. "And I only knew Jake for one afternoon," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "But in that afternoon, he taught me something about family. He showed me that the people we choose to love can matter just as much as the people we're born to love." The crowd was completely silent except for the occasional sniffle or whispered "Amen." Jake was dying when he knocked on my door, but he wasn't looking for pity. He was looking for connection, for someone to see him as more than his illness, more than his appearance, more than the assumptions people made about who he was. Margaret's eyes found Tommy in the crowd, then Big Mike, then the Rodriguez brothers. He told me about all of you, about the charity rides, the hospitals you've supported, the veterans you've helped, the community you've built around brotherhood and service. He was proud to be part of this family, proud to call you his brothers and sisters. The emotional weight in the air was palpable. Grown men who looked like they could handle anything were wiping tears from their eyes. Jake's final wish wasn't for himself. It was for all of you. He wanted you to know how much you meant to him, how much your friendship had sustained him through the hardest parts of his life. He wanted you to understand that loving someone doesn't mean protecting them from difficulty. It means standing with them in the difficulty. Margaret paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Today, all of you have honored that wish. You've shown that true family shows up. True family makes noise when someone needs to be heard. True family ensures that no one faces their final journey alone. The service continued with stories, laughter, and the kind of remembrance that celebrates a life fully lived. But for Margaret, the most powerful moment came at the very end, when Tommy approached her with something in his hands. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "the brothers and we talked about it, and we want you to have this." He held out Jake's leather vest, the one covered with patches that told the story of his life on the road. "We want you to be an honorary member of our family. Jake said you understood what brotherhood really means, and after today, we can see he was right." Margaret accepted the vest with trembling hands, understanding the significance of what she was being offered. This wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was acceptance into a community that didn't give its trust lightly. "There's one more thing," Big Mike added. "We've decided to establish a fund in Jake's name, for people like him who are facing their final journey alone. We want to make sure no one has to die without knowing they're loved." As the bikes began to fire up for their departure, creating a thunder that could be heard throughout the entire town, Margaret realized that Jake's final wish had accomplished something none of them had expected. He had brought together a community, not just his biker family, but her neighbors, her town, people who had never understood the culture he represented, but now saw the humanity beneath the leather and chrome. The last bike pulled away as the sun was setting, leaving Margaret standing in her front yard, still wearing Jake's vest, surrounded by the lingering scent of motorcycle exhaust and the echoes of a celebration that had honored not just one man's life, but the connections that make life meaningful. That evening, as Margaret sat on her front porch watching the stars emerge, her phone began to ring. The first call came from a reporter at the local newspaper, then the radio station, then a television crew from the state capitol. Word of Jake's memorial service had spread far beyond Millfield, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the elderly woman who had opened her home to a dying biker and his unconventional family. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Sarah Chen from Channel 7 News. We'd like to do a story about what happened at your house yesterday." The community response has been incredible. Margaret politely declined the interviews. This wasn't about publicity or recognition. It was about honoring Jake's memory and the promise she had made to him. But the calls kept coming. Not just from media outlets, but from people across the country who had heard Jake's story through the motorcycle community's network. Families who had lost loved ones to cancer, veterans struggling with isolation, people who had felt forgotten by the world and found hope in the story of a biker who died surrounded by love. 3 weeks after the memorial service, Margaret received a package with no return address. Inside was a photo album filled with pictures she had never seen before. Jake as a young man in military uniform, Jake with Sarah on their wedding day, Jake at charity events, surrounded by children whose hospital stays had been brightened by his visits. The final page contained a handwritten letter from Tommy. "Hi, dear Margaret. We wanted you to see who Jake really was. These pictures show the man you helped us remember. The fund we started in his name has already received donations from 47 states. People are sharing their own stories of loneliness, of illness, of feeling forgotten. Your kindness to our brother started something bigger than any of us imagined." Margaret carefully placed the album on her coffee table, next to Robert's photographs. Two different kinds of love, two different families, but the same lesson about the power of showing up for someone when they need it most. The next morning, she heard a familiar rumble outside. Margaret looked out her window to see a single motorcycle in her driveway. A young woman climbed off the bike, removing her helmet to reveal tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Thompson?" the woman called out. "My name is Lisa. I was Jake's niece. I just found out about everything that happened. I wanted to thank you." Margaret invited Lisa inside, pouring tea while the young woman explained how she had lost touch with Jake after Sarah's death. Family disagreements, geographical distance, the busy pace of modern life had created barriers that seemed impossible to cross. Sometimes the most powerful last wishes aren't about what we want for ourselves, but about the connections we leave behind. Jake's simple request for someone to care became a bridge that united an entire community. Margaret discovered that true kindness doesn't just comfort the dying, it transforms the living. Their story proves that family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up when it matters most. If this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember they're not alone.